Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about a guide to help boards oversee ESG integration into their corporation. And joining me to have this discussion is Tracey-Lee Brown, who's a director with PwC's Governance Insight Center. Welcome, Tracey-Lee.
Thank you, TK. I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Well, first of all, this ESG has caused a lot of scrambling in the boardroom. Okay, people are trying to get their arms around it. They're trying to define it. They're trying to understand how to work it into strategy, all those things. And I have been very impressed with the guide that PwC published titled ESG Oversight, the Corporate Director's Guide, because I think that it has simplified it as much as you can at this point in time until we get some definitive information either from the SEC or the World Economic Forum or whatever. Everybody's trying to do that, okay? But I think you guys have taken a very good approach to the guide, and that's what I'd like to talk about. So let's start this way. What were the goals of PwC in creating this guide, particularly when I'm sure you saw boards sort of struggling with this?
Yes, so as you mentioned, ESG is a hot topic for boards these days, and it's certainly the number one topic that we've been speaking to boards about. And through those conversations, we were getting a lot of questions and a lot of the same type of questions coming through as well. And it was with that in mind that we wanted to develop the guide to help directors with ESG oversight. And we specifically wanted to hone in on why exactly directors need to oversee ESG, what it is that they need to oversee, and then how do they go about that oversight. I do want to mention that the current version of the guide is actually an updated version since we first issued it back in 2020. And the reason for that is merely the ESG landscape is evolving and so much has and is happening in this space. So, yeah.
My guess is that is not the last time you're going to update
For
the guide.
sure not. For sure not.
One of my favorite sections in the guide, though, is where you actually define ESG. And again, I know how boards struggle, particularly defining them, the E, the S, and the G. And you guys, I think, in this chart do a pretty good job of doing that. So that is very helpful.
Yes, and so that graphic is actually not meant to be all-inclusive because there are a number of standards and frameworks out there that have identified their own topics that fall within the E, S, and G bucket. But we wanted to include that graphic to just illustrate how broad ESG really is and the fact that it is applicable to every company in every industry.
Like you said in your when you talked about your goals, that you wanted to make sure that the directors had something so they knew their role in overseeing. Talk a little bit about their role, that section.
So that's the larger part of the guide is the what directors exactly need to oversee. And so I'll touch on some of those oversight areas. And firstly, starting with the purpose, for companies to take a step back, look at the company's purpose and whether that incorporates the broader stakeholder group, such as your customers, your employees, and the communities in which the company operates. The next item is strategy, understanding whether ESG is integrated into the company strategy. ESG is not something that should be alongside the day-to-day. It should be part of the day-to-day. Another item of oversight is ESG risks. So understanding how management has identified ESG risks, how they plan on measuring and mitigating those risks, and also understanding whether it is incorporated into the broader enterprise risk management process. The other area is disclosures, and there are a number of elements to consider around disclosures. One being the reliability of the information being disclosed. So understanding how is that information collected, where is it coming from, what does the control environment look like around that ESG information. Again, standards and frameworks. Many companies have adopted standards and frameworks, but understanding whether that actually meets the needs of the broader stakeholder group. And then where to disclose as well. Companies are making their disclosures and ESG reports and SEC filings, as well as company websites as well. I do want to note that we have added 2 new sections in the guide, which I feel directors will probably find helpful too. The first is around materiality considerations. Boards often want to understand how should they think about materiality in the context of ESG. And so we outline that in the guide. And then we also have a maturity assessment to help boards understand and assess where their companies fall from a process and disclosure perspective. And there are a number of elements to consider there as well. And I'll just name a few, such as the control environment, understanding whether the company obtains assurance over any metrics, whether the company is using any type of technology, for example, for data collection, etc. And then I'd say the last area of oversight is around measuring and monitoring progress. So understanding whether many companies have set targets and goals, and so how's the company trading towards those goals, and perhaps it would be useful to hold management accountable by tying those type of ESG metrics and KPIs to executive compensation, as we see many companies are doing as well. So I've very quickly touched on the areas of oversight, but of course in the guide we go into a lot more detail on each of those areas.
Well, you certainly touched on why I think it's a valuable tool.
Yeah.
Okay. There is, interestingly, a push by investors and by regulators to make sure that companies integrate ESG into the corporate strategy,
Yeah.
okay? And that is a challenge,
Yeah.
okay? But I understand that you guys address that, and you address questions that board members should be asking relative to that. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And so it's in the guidebook, of course, but maybe just to touch on a few of those questions. The first is, again, and I talked about this just a bit earlier, but understanding whether the purpose takes into account the broader stakeholder group. And if with that, the company's actually changed or updated the company's strategy to account for that. Another consideration is around what is your competitors, what does their purpose look like? How have they articulated their purpose, and how does that compare to that of the company? And then another question just to highlight there is around ESG risks and opportunities, and whether the company has updated the strategy to incorporate those risks and opportunities. Again, definitely more in the guidebook, but just wanted to highlight some of those questions and considerations.
So we've done an effective job of teasing our audience.
Yes.
Now. So where can people get a full copy of the guide and actually use it as a tool?
Sure. So the guidebook is available on pwc.com, and specifically the Governance Insight Center, we have our own resource page, and it's available under the ESG resources on our page. So won't miss it.
Tracey-Lee Brown, thank you for taking the time to join us and talk about the guide. Again, I think it's something that people should take advantage of because it's certainly very helpful.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yep.
Thanks.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.